the first thing people noticed was the roof. Because there was almost nothing else to notice. No tall walls. No wide porch. No chimney rising high above the valley. Just a roof. A massive sloping roof beginning near the center ridge and stretching almost all the way to the ground on both sides until the entire cabin looked less like a house and more like a strange wooden hill dropped onto the snow. People laughed immediately. Did he forget to build the walls? That thing looks like a shed somebody stepped on. Maybe he ran out of lumber halfway through. No one laughed harder than Harlan Pike. He stood beside the trading post staring toward the structure and shook his head. Elias Mercer built himself a giant wooden triangle. The nickname spread through Bitter Creek within days. Mercer's Triangle. Children repeated it whenever they walked past. Adults repeated it because they thought it was funny. Elias ignored all of them, because unlike the others in Bitter Creek, he had spent 2 winters working mountain freight routes through northern passes where snow behaved differently. Up there, snow wasn't soft. It moved. It drifted. It stacked. And eventually, it crushed things. Elias learned that lesson during his first season north. He remembered watching a Strom Square supply cabin disappear beneath drifting snow after 3 storms hit in a row. The walls held. The beams held. Then the roof collected too much weight. Everything beneath it failed at once. Meanwhile, an older trapper farther along the route lived in something strange. A low structure with a sharply sloping roof reaching almost to the ground. Snow slid off constantly. Wind wrapped around it instead of striking broad walls. The trapper told him something Elias never forgot. Winter can't break what it can't grab. At the time, Elias thought the old man sounded half crazy. Years later, after inheriting his father's land in Bitter Creek, those words returned. Especially after seeing the valley build the same way over and over. Tall walls. Steep exposed roofs. Large surfaces for wind and snow to attack. Everyone built for summer comfort. Almost nobody built for winter pressure. So Elias built differently. Construction began during spring. The foundation sat low into the ground rather than raised high like neighboring cabins. Fixed support beams ran directly from the center ridge nearly to the earth itself, creating 2 enormous roof slopes instead of traditional walls. The cabin looked unusual even before completion. By midsummer, travelers slowed wagons simply to stare. Because the building appeared almost unfinished. The roof dominated everything. Side walls barely rose chest-high before disappearing beneath descending timber beams. Children asked where the rest of the house was. Harlan Pike laughed so hard one afternoon, he nearly dropped his grain sack. You planning on standing inside this thing? Elias tightened a roof brace calmly. Planning on surviving inside it. That answer only made people laugh more. But Elias understood something they didn't. The roof wasn't decoration. It was the structure. Traditional cabins carried weight through vertical walls into foundations. Elias's design carried weight directly downward through angled beams into the earth itself. That changed everything. Snow landing on the roof would slide naturally instead of piling heavily. Wind would strike the steep angles and move upward rather than hammer flat surfaces. Pressure would travel downward along the frame instead of concentrating at weak joints. Every part of the design worked together. By autumn, the cabin finally stood complete. And Bitter Creek laughed harder than ever. Because from outside, Mercer's Triangle looked tiny. Ridiculously tiny. But stepping inside changed everything. The sloping roof created lower exterior profiles while maintaining surprising interior space beneath the center ridge. Thick insulated walls lined the lower sections while heat from the stove circulated naturally beneath the angled ceiling. Warm air moved differently. Snow and wind behaved differently. Everything behaved differently. Caleb Turner noticed first after visiting one cold evening. He stood beside the stove looking around uncertainly. It feels bigger than it looked. Elias smiled slightly. That's because you expected a roof with a room under it. Caleb frowned. Isn't that what it is? No. Elias tapped one of the heavy angled support beams. The room exists because of the roof. Caleb looked confused. Most people thought walls held houses up. Here the roof held almost everything. That idea unsettled him, because it challenged what everyone in Bitter Creek believed about building. The first hard winter winds arrived in November. Northern gusts rolled across the valley carrying sharp ice crystals and freezing temperatures behind them. Families sealed windows, stacked extra firewood, checked roof braces. Elias watched snow carefully. That was what interested him most. Not temperature, Movement. During the first storm, snow gathered against neighboring cabins exactly as expected. Drifts piled along exposed walls and beneath roof edges, while wind curled violently around corners. Around Elias's cabin something different happened. Snow struck the roof, then slid downward. Wind reached the structure, then moved around it. Drifts formed naturally beside the lower edges, creating additional insulation against the earth-packed sides rather than dangerous pressure points. Caleb saw it happen during a visit after the storm. He walked around the structure slowly staring. "You barely have snow on top." Elias nodded. "Because it doesn't stay there." Caleb looked toward Harlan's cabin across the valley where workers already shoveled heavy drifts from the roof. "You planned that." "I planned for winter." Word spread quietly after that. Not loudly, not enough to stop the jokes, but enough that people started watching more carefully. Because Elias burned less wood too. The low profile reduced exposed wall surface, while drifting snow added insulation around the lower edges naturally. The cabin stayed warmer longer. Wind stole less heat. Even Harlan noticed eventually, though he refused to admit concern openly. Then December arrived, and with it came strange weather from the north. Old ranchers stopped smiling. Pressure dropped quickly. Birds disappeared. The sky changed color. People began tying roofs down harder than usual. Because stories started spreading through Bitter Creek. Stories about a storm building beyond the mountains. A storm nobody had seen in decades. 3 days later, it arrived. The storm did not arrive with snow first. It arrived with wind. Deep, low wind rolling down from the mountains like something alive. By sunset, Bitter Creek could already hear it. Cabin shutters rattled. Barn doors groaned. Loose fence boards clattered against posts. And by nightfall, the valley disappeared. Snow blasted sideways hard enough to erase entire buildings beyond a few yards. Lantern light vanished almost immediately outside cabin windows. People tied ropes between houses and barns so they would not disappear crossing their own yards. Inside Mercer's triangle, Elias sat beside the stove listening carefully. Not to the storm, to the cabin. Every building speaks under pressure. Square cabins groan at corners. Flat roofs complain beneath weight. Weak beams crack. Mercer's triangle sounded different. The wind struck, then slid. Snow landed, then moved. The angled beams transferred pressure downward through the frame directly into the earth. Nothing fought the storm. Everything redirected it. That difference mattered. Hours passed. The wind intensified. Then came the first distant cracking sound. Elias sat upright immediately. Not thunder, timber. Somewhere beyond the storm, something heavy had failed. Then came another. Then another. The valley was beginning to break. The pounding at his door came shortly after midnight. Elias forced it open against screaming wind and nearly lost his footing. Caleb Turner stumbled inside, carrying his younger brother beneath one arm. Snow exploded across the floor before Elias shoved the door closed again. For several seconds Caleb simply stood there staring. Because despite the storm outside, the cabin felt calm. Not warm exactly. Stable. The stove burned low. The walls barely creaked. No freezing drafts slid across the floor. "How?" Caleb finally asked. Elias removed snow from the boy's coat. "The storm can't hold onto the house." Caleb looked upward. The ceiling angled sharply above them, while heavy support beams disappeared into the floor itself. Outside, the storm screamed harder. Inside, the structure barely seemed to notice. Another knock came. Then another. Soon Harlan Pike appeared with his wife after losing part of their roof beneath drifting snow. Then Mrs. Tolland and her grandson. Then the Miller family. One by one, people arrived from failing cabins throughout Bitter Creek. By 2 in the morning, nearly a dozen people crowded inside the structure everyone once called ridiculous. Nobody laughed anymore. Outside, the storm became monstrous. Snow buried windows entirely. Chimneys snapped beneath pressure. Heavy drifts piled against vertical walls until some cabins looked half underground. But Mercer's triangle changed with the weather instead of fighting it. Snow slid down the steep roof naturally, preventing dangerous accumulation. Drifts formed along the lower sides where Elias wanted them. That surprised everyone most. Because instead of threatening the structure, snow actually strengthened it. The packed drifts created additional insulation against the low walls while supporting lower sections against wind pressure. The storm itself reinforced the design. Harlan noticed first. He pressed one hand against the lower wall and frowned. "The snow's helping it." Elias nodded. Winter's strongest material is snow. Nobody understood immediately, so Elias explained. Fresh snow traps enormous amounts of air. Packed snow insulates surprisingly well. That was why animals burrowed beneath it during storms. That was why snow shelters worked. Mercer's triangle used the same idea naturally. The roof guided snow where it helped rather than where it harmed. Caleb stared upward slowly. You built a house that uses the storm. Elias added another small log to the stove. I built a house that lets winter do what it wants. That sentence settled quietly around the room. Because everyone else in Bitter Creek spent their lives fighting winter directly. Thicker walls, larger roofs, stronger beams, more resistance. Mercer's triangle did something different. It cooperated. Around 3 in the morning, a gust struck hard enough to shake several distant structures violently. Then came another terrible cracking sound, longer this time, followed by shouting somewhere outside. People inside the cabin fell silent, because everyone knew what that sound meant now. Another roof, another failure. But Mercer's triangle simply settled slightly beneath the wind and remained still. The structure carried force downward through its angled frame, while the low profile prevented the storm from grabbing broad surfaces. No weak corners. No exposed walls. No flat roof collecting disaster. Everything existed for one purpose: survive winter. The storm continued nearly 2 full days. 2 endless days of wind and snow swallowing Bitter Creek entirely. Inside Elias's cabin, people burned less wood than expected because heat stayed trapped efficiently beneath the low insulated profile. The stove never needed roaring fires, only steady ones. Children slept beside walls. Adults sheared blankets. People waited, and eventually, the storm weakened. Morning arrived pale and silent. Elias opened the door carefully. Nobody moved behind him, because everyone suddenly felt afraid to see what remained. Outside, Bitter Creek looked broken. Snow buried fences completely. Several cabins had partially collapsed. One roof lay twisted nearly 50 yards away. Sheds disappeared beneath drifts. Chimneys leaned at impossible angles. But Mercer's triangle still stood exactly where it had before. Snow wrapped around its lower edges naturally, while the steep roof remained mostly clear. Smoke continued rising quietly into the cold morning sky. Harlan stepped outside slowly and stared, then laughed once. Not mockingly, almost in disbelief. All that time, he said softly. He looked toward Elias. We thought the roof looked ridiculous. Elias brushed snow from his gloves. Winter didn't. Word spread quickly after that storm. The low roof survived better than every cabin in Bitter Creek. The angled design shed snow naturally. Wind moved around it instead of attacking it. The storm itself helped insulate it. By spring, people started changing their homes. Lower roof lines, steeper angles, reduced wall exposure. Some built storm shelters using similar designs. Nobody called it Mercer's triangle anymore. Now they called it Mercer's roof. And long after the great storm passed into Bitter Creek legend, travelers still stopped beside the strange cabin with the roof nearly touching the snow. Most expected it to feel small. Instead, they found one of the strongest homes in the valley, built around one simple idea. Winter cannot break what it cannot hold.